Thank you to all. See all of our partners and visit us at learnwithcure.com. There's so much to talk about in a short 60 minutes. And immediately following, stay on the webinar for a musical offering inspired by Miss Wilkerson's first book, Warmth of Other Suns, written and performed by Martin Luther McCoy and recorded by the City Church of San Francisco. Please also take a minute to respond to the event with a short survey, which will help guide Cure's offerings in the future. Cure is grateful for our fiscal sponsor, the Larchmont Amerenik Lions Club. Everything we do is funded by you, so consider making a donation to help continue the conversation. Tonight, we're focusing on Chapter 8 of Caste, the Nazis and the Acceleration of Caste. As our guides, we have two of Westchester's beloved faith leaders, Rabbi Jeffrey Sirkman of the Larchmont Temple and Reverend Dr. William P. Crawford, formerly the Larchmont Avenue Church. As dear friends, they have a long history of bringing the perspectives of their traditions together with love and humor. They will discuss the chapter for 30 minutes, then transition to your questions. Please post questions only in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. The chat function has been disabled for this evening. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome Reverend Crawford and Rabbi Sirkman.
Thanks, Stacy.
Thank you very much, Stacy. Great to be with you. Great to be with my brother and friend, Rabbi Jeff Sirkman. As Stacy mentioned, we are going to embark on these next 30 minutes with an introduction and attention to the book, particularly with regard to Chapter 8, relation of Jim Crow with the Nazi steps in Germany and treatment of the Jews. And then open it up to questions. There's much to consider. I'm glad to be here again with my friend and colleague, Rabbi Jeff. And I'll begin by noting, along with those intro words from Stacy, some great thanks to Cure and the fabulous Westchester Library System and the so many sponsors who helped to bring this about. Stay tuned for more on that. The book itself is an extraordinary document. Isabel Wilkerson has endeavored for about 20 years in the writing of this, and along the way managed to write another very important document, Toward a Warmer Sun, which was published in 2010. In that endeavor, she had conducted about 1,200 interviews and brought us to the attention of the Great Migration from the South from 1915 to about 1970. And focused on three individuals in particular. Many of you have read that. Many of you have read this volume that we're considering tonight, Caste. And even if you haven't, we hope to introduce you and engage you and it's spurring you on to further consideration and, yes, discussion of this very important, again, extraordinary document. Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. Let me note that as we lead up to Chapter 8, there is much to consider. Yes, in the book, but certainly the history. Caste is an introduction, the term, the more than the concept, the reality that she presents, without ever really considering or naming or using the words race or racism. She talks in terms of dominant caste and middle caste and lower caste along the way. She describes and takes great effort to do so, caste as the skeleton, if you will, the structure of a house, and noting racism or race as the skin or the construction therein. As she begins, this definition comes through in a rather vivid way, and I want to call it to your attention, and you can discover it in the early pages, page 17 to be exact. Caste system, she writes, is an artificial construction, a fixed and embedded ranking of human value that sees the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of other groups on the basis of ancestry and other immutable traits, traits that would be neutral in the abstract, but are ascribed in life and death meaning. As we go about our daily lives, caste is the wordless usher in a darkened theater. Flashlight cast down in the aisles, guiding us to our assigned seats for a performance. She observes that caste is about respect, authority, and assumption of competence. Who is accorded these and who is not? Where does this come from? And then as we look at our American experience, she gives us history. She's a profound historian and journalist. Yes, a Pulitzer Prize winner for her journalistic endeavors, and yes, the acclaim for her first book and now this second one. She points us to 1619, a date in infamy. The New York Times introduced the 1619 Project in its embarking a couple years ago with great work underway. It notes the landing of a certain slave ship. Some say it was headed to another direction, but commandeered to the shores of Jamestown in Virginia. There were 20 slaves, soon to be slaves, upon their embarking on this shoreline. And then from that, in the state of Virginia, over the next decades, until we get to 1775, if you will, that number 20 escalated to some 200,000 plus. And along the way, Virginia, that state, in colonial times, the largest of the colonies, perhaps 400,000 residents as things grew to that colonial period. Half of those 400,000 were indentured, enslaved individuals. And along the way, the state in its mechanism established slave laws, infamous in Virginia. In 1640, there was an adjudication, if we could call it that, of 3 runaway slaves, 2 of whom were white and were given some time-limited sentence. One of them was African, Black, and that individual, John Punch, let his name be known, was conscribed to a lifetime of slavery and servitude. That was one legal judicial step, if you will, along the way of those established laws in Virginia, which came to identify and articulate property. Remember those words in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the state of Virginia, it was life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. Or is it in its antecedent from John Locke over in Europe, it was life, liberty, and estate. Well, those individuals, those slaves were property, were the estate. And from that set of laws, slave laws in Virginia, we came to find the great and extensive system of slavery and servitude and the caste that it recognized and proscribed along the way. That, as we move our way through the beginnings of the United States, even up to and past the Civil War, where indeed we had the Declaration of Emancipation in the 13th Amendment, but it wasn't really freedom of the slaves, because just as quickly after Lincoln declared that and then died, here came Andrew Johnson and a whole set of statutes known as the Black Codes. And freedom was certainly not to be the case for those in that slavery and servitude caste. Moving along the way, we had various statutes and proscribed laws and procedures, to put it mildly, that came to be known as Jim Crow. And that meant, yes, economic servitude, lack of voting in so many prescribed ways, not to mention economic, not merely inequality, but conscription in so many distinct ways. Along the way, wanting to paint this picture, here came the strides and the reality in these United States of America, not to be unnoticed by people on other shores. And that brings us to chapter 8 of this book, this important volume by Isabel Wilkerson, where we find in 1934 a distinct gathering of those who are part of the emerging Third Reich. And they're discussing and mapping out cues and codes for purity. And one very distinct correlation and connection is to the reality of Jim Crow and those laws and the establishment of them and practice of all of that here in these United States. That really is not just material, but a predicate in so many ways for the consideration that's to become the foundation for the steps of the Nazi movement in the Third Reich. Let me turn now to my friend and colleague, Rabbi Jeff, for
let me just jump in, Reverend Bill, because I don't want to lose it, because don't go to 1940 yet with Reverend Bill. Ask yourself, first of all, this is a daunting day in Jewish calendar. I'll tell you why in a little bit. It's a daunting day to be here and awesome to be here with Reverend Bill, but it's almost haunting as well. We all read, or most of us hopefully read this book. We saw that the Holocaust didn't just happen. As a student, starting the first year, that Professor Wiesel, that's Elie Wiesel, the great Nobel laureate and really survivor's witness, was at Boston University and becoming one of Wiesel's students and his TA, his teaching assistant. Wiesel would always teach us the Holocaust is unique, and I believe that. As the organized, state-organized, systematic isolation, dehumanization, persecution, and then annihilation of 1 out of every 3 Jews in the world. 6 million Jews, not to mention the Roma, the Gypsy people, anybody disabled, plenty of Soviet Russian POWs, plenty of Jehovah's Witnesses, plenty of political dissidents. You can keep going up to 11 million. It was unique. However, as a institutional state stratification of society, it's not unique. Because, as Reverend Bill just alluded, what was the model for a 1920 Adolf Hitler, then really rising in the ranks of the National Socialist German Workers' Party? What was his model? When he spoke at the Hofbrauhaus in Munich in 1920 and wanted to he proposed, in fact, revoking Jewish citizenship and deporting Jews to foreign lands. His model was the eugenicists, as we read, in America. In fact, people in the burgeoning Reich, which wasn't established yet, had been studying in America. And so the books by Stoddard and Madison Grant especially, who hung out in pretty prestigious circles, Herbert Hoover, Teddy Roosevelt, his book, The Passing of the Great Race, written in 1916, Hitler said, "This book is my Bible." How haunting is that? What was, and I think Wilkerson and Reverend Bill chime in on this, because I want to get back and forth here. Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, his magnum opus, and published it in 1924. Listen with an air towards our previous president what the subtitle of Mein Kampf is. 4.5 years of struggle against lies, idiocy, and cowardice. Oh my God. Hitler, as Wilkerson points out, who never held public office, right? So what do we see in this? We see, as Wilkerson says, I think so aptly, that America was the model. As she says, the American paradox of proclaiming liberty for all men while holding subsets of its citizenry in near total subjugation. And so rather than a 12-year period of annihilation and destruction, America extended it over hundreds of years. Reverend Bill.
Well, indeed, the sobering realities of what has been witnessed, evident to so many, as Rabbi Jeff notes, 11 million. And here are the identity of the Jewish people, but also others, gypsies, of those of different sexual orientation, various folk in and among that number. This was indeed systematic. It's harrowing and haunting to see and to understand, as Isabel Wilkerson takes great pains to note, those antecedents and the drawing from the American experience. The literature, and again, to refer to this chapter 8, this journalist, Ms. Wilkerson, takes pains to note these names and let them be known. Madison Grant is one of those writers whose writing, while he consorted with President Herbert Hoover and rubbed elbows with such a clientele, if you will, his volume was noted as with great favor by Adolf Hitler, who referred to it as his Bible. And also in terms of the understandings which helped to fuel the considerations which became, and Rabbi Jeff can speak more on this too, the Nuremberg Laws, or the blood laws for Germany, were derived from some research, if you will, by a student there among the Reich regime, who was an exchange student in the state of Arkansas.
Right, but Nuremberg Laws for the protection of German blood and honor. Jews stripped of citizenship, deprived of civil rights, prevented from even having any intimate relations with Germans, no sex with a German. In essence, step one, isolation, absolute, total, utter isolation. But remember the name they were called in German, Untermenschen, subhuman. So Chris, do we have that slide of the village sign, right? That village sign, just real quick, so we can see that slide, right? Right. So this is just right after the Nuremberg Laws, villages would put up signs. What does this sign say? I happen to be a German major in high school. Juden sind in Beringersdorf nicht erwünscht, right? Jews are not wanted in our village of Beringersdorf. This was common. You'd think, oh my God, but we would never do something like that in America in the 1930s. Kivy Kaplan, the eventual Jewish, Boston-based Jewish chair of the NAACP in the 60s, in 1943 was traveling with a chauffeur who was a black chauffeur in Tallahassee. And when they pulled up to the hotel, it said, Jews and Negroes not allowed. That's when Kivy Kaplan said, I can't stand by, because complicity is the greatest sin. Reverend Bill, am I not right?
Indeed. The element of complicity, if I could, is something of a thread throughout this volume, Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. And she starts it, just to hold that note for a second, with a narrative describing a picture. She doesn't give us that picture in photographic presentation, but her words describe it. And Chris is our tech man back at the Rye Library. Thank you, Chris. Could you present that picture to us and for us, please? That is not it. We're looking for, this is a worker
You're so
event.
impatient. Nothing has changed. You're so impatient, Reverend Bill.
There we go. Thank you. My brother Rabbi here. This is a picture of a workers' rally in Berlin in 1936. And if you look, there's a circled figure that you'll see there in the upper right-hand section of the picture. His name, as it's come to be discovered or at least believed, is August Landmesser. He is distinct in refusing or abstaining, certainly, from a Sikh Heil salute. His arms are crossed. His face is of a different expression. He's simply not abiding by or going along with what happens. Wilkerson takes pains to note this picture with her words at the very beginning. Here is one who did not go along, who had questions and concerns. He, like so many in the greater part of that picture or elsewhere in various different times, was concerned about economic justice, about workers' rights, about income. And this crowd was buying what was being sold or proclaimed by the speaker, who happened to be Adolf Hitler. Isabel Wilkerson notes this picture with her words at the beginning of the book, and then holds this for us as she proceeds with the account of caste leading up to this chapter, and then many following, which you'll be discussing in the next several sessions. But here, the element of complicity is one that we do need to take note of.
Reverend Bill, my favorite verse in the Holiness Code, Leviticus 19, is not, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. My favorite verse in the Holiness Code is, you shall not stand idle while your neighbor bleeds. To me, that's what complicity or countering complicity is about. Standing up.
Well, holding that thought, there is the moral call to, opposite from complicity, to speak up, to stand up, to respond, is, again, as she notes it, there's a morality to that in rather distinct ways. In that same time, yes, in that same country, Germany, there was one who is named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and we have a picture of him as well, a German Lutheran pastor who studied at Union Theological Seminary in 1933, where I did also, not at that time, and then came back for some further study in 1939 at Union. Bonhoeffer was part of a group of committed people of faith called the Confessing Church, and in many ways, he so ardently refused or stood apart from complicity, but struggled with what his step and intervention would be, such that he was eventually a member of the SS only because he was wanting to infiltrate and to make a stand and to strategize what became a plan to assassinate Hitler, for which Bonhoeffer himself, albeit on tomorrow's date, April 9th, in the year 1945, after being incarcerated in a concentration camp in Flossenburg, Bonhoeffer himself was assassinated, hanged, killed. But for Bonhoeffer, in response to this awful sense of complicity, he basically, and Wilkerson cites him rather well in the 9th chapter, to stand by and to speak nothing in the face of evil is evil itself.
You know, that reminds me, Reverend Bill, of Bonhoeffer's colleague, because in the 1930s, 34 to be exact, it was the Lutherans who were standing up against some Christian denominations who were just throwing their hat in the ring with Hitler. And so it was the Barmen's Declaration, or Barmen Declaration, by Martin Niemöller in Berlin, that affirmed the Jewish roots of Christianity and the validity of the Hebrew Bible. Of course, Niemöller is most known not for his concentration camp imprisonment for 8 years because of it, but this simple poem, which really speaks out against complicity. And think about it in terms of the casteism we face in America today and what we're doing. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out for I was not a socialist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out for I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out.
Martin Niemöller, Reverend Martin Niemöller. I'm a witness to my beloved rabbi who can quote Torah and certainly the book of Leviticus, as we just heard, but he also can quote Protestant pastors rather well, as he has just done. Niemöller was another one who was vexed by the horror and atrocities of the Nazi regime, and issued forth not just that statement, but stood with Bonhoeffer and others in their response, only to meet their demise. Rabbi Jeff, there is more to say in this 8th chapter. We have a few minutes more to address that, but then also we wanted very much to refer people to the 9th chapter that follows.
Right, but can we do one more thing in the 8th real quick? If we can get that picture of the inmates of Auschwitz up, Chris, because I want people to understand, why is the Black Lives Matter movement so essential? It's actually so we know the names, so we don't mistake numbers for people, so we don't actually do what the Nazis did and just keep going back to 1 when you reach 100,000 annihilated. So we know the names of those who are oppressed, who are scapegoated. If you look at these inmates, you just think, well, bunch of inmates in Auschwitz. It's horrendous. It's right with the beginning of liberation, a picture taken. But if you know well this picture, as do I, then you know each one has a name, each one has a family, each life lost, the Talmud tells us, is a world entire. But if you go to the middle, 2 bunks up, what you see is, on the far right, Elie Wiesel. Gaunt, almost ghostly. I remember him in class holding the picture up and saying, "Do I still look the same? I died there in the camp, and I was reborn." Most of us don't have the opportunity to be reborn once we go through that inhuman oppression. And we've certainly witnessed too many deaths of those oppressed by the system, the casteism, we call it racism, that persists. Reverend Bill, chapter 9.
Chapter 9 is in the flow of this important volume by Isabel Wilkerson. Chapter 9 is one of those passages that for those who have read it and those who are yet to read it, is presented in italicized font. It's along with the other chapters and pieces that are copious history, outlining the systematic efforts of Jim Crow, as well as here this Nazi regime and the Nuremberg Laws or blood laws, and then back to Jim Crow and the Black Codes and the succession across the history of these United States, in which, this volume has been said It addresses the wounds of America that have yet to clot as we recognize caste and the consequential race and racism from that. But that systematic accounting from this very important historian and journalist, Isabel Wilkerson, who you will be hearing as we gather with her over this video Zoom on April 25th, she then, almost as a relief and pause to herself, as well as to and for the readers, gives us these, again, italicized accounts and storylines. And as Rabbi Jeff kind of handed this little point off to me, or not so little, that section 2, again, chapter 9, gives a couple of those stories, one of which is an account of a trial in the city of Omaha, Nebraska. A Negro Black man is convicted, no surprise. You can read the specifics of this, but then there in the crowd, as there's an uproar over what has happened, and the townsfolk are pausing and really want more blood and want to take the justice or whatever into their own hands. There's not just abuse to the jurors, but also to the man himself, who is lynched before their eyes. There on the streets in the crowd is a young man and his father. And the young man is Henry Fonda. Yes, Henry Fonda, that actor, that father of Jane Fonda, who never could forget the searing impact of witnessing and watching that, and the horror of what it meant for those to be going along with the crowd. Again, the complicity of all that. If you've seen the film Oxbow Incident, his portrayal of the character in that he plays is very much informed by that very event. The horror of the event, yes, and the shame of the complicity that he shudders to think that he could be complicit himself. I see Stacy on the screen. Stacy, Rabbi Jeff and I
we are barely through our we have another hour and a half, Stacy. So I'd like to provide popcorn for everybody, and if there are questions, we're glad to entertain them.
Yeah,
we're definitely.
Thank you, and thank the Cure crew for great work and effort on all this. And we're glad to turn it over for you for questions that those of you who are watching may have, and we're glad to engage further. So here we go, Stacy.
Thank you both. We're definitely going to need to do a round 2, and the taking us from the beginning to the bottom and the top and the sides. I have chills. Thank you. I just want to remind everyone on the webinar that we're asking to put questions in the Q&A. And we're not able to respond to raise hands or the chat in this format. So please go ahead. We have a few questions already, but we don't want to miss anybody. Trying to sort of scroll through them. Sorry. Here's one that I think is helpful. What keeps a caste system functioning? Why, what are the primary aspects of a culture or of a people that keep a caste system functioning in dominant groups and middle groups and suppressed groups?
Can I start? I'll start.
Please.
So I quote my teachers often. So Professor Wiesel in class in a long time ago, the later 70s, said, for the first time I heard, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of life is not death, it's indifference. What keeps a caste system functioning is indifference. Is us saying, well, I'm not a racist. I'm not part of that. No. I have nothing to do with that. Oh, yes, you do. Because if you don't stand up and say, not on my watch, then you are indifferent. So the number one thing is our refusal to admit the systemic injustice that's perpetuated by racist policies, by casteist policies that we are, witness to and do nothing. Reverend Bill.
Yeah, Stacey, it's a wonderful question, and I'm sure for the individual who asked it, it's kind of, there's echoes from other folks as well. And to understand how it's put in place and enforced is, to hear what Rabbi Jeff just said. Yes, the complicity, which may seem innocent and abiding and going along with the flow, but it's also, along with that, or a consequence, or even a starting point for that, are distinctions put in place. And this is what I think Isabel Wilkerson endeavors to do and does quite well, namely the structure that, defines and establishes a factor reality that this person is better than this other person, and the other is distinguished and separated and diminished. And from that, here are decisions and sets and codes and practices that have flown from that. That's why it was not exciting for me to do, as I was speaking a little bit ago, because I love the kind of the bump and rock and roll and spirit that I share with my friend Rabbi Jeff in discourse. But that whole from 1619 to the present in these United States, and the account of that structure, caste, as Isabel Wilkerson puts it forth, is really quite systematic. Michelle Alexander treats it even further as she talks about new castes being developed as we go forward.
Let's go with another question, because I don't want to lose the questions, because I also want to cite something else about othering that eventually I'll bring up with Reverend Bill. But
yeah, so I think that the complicity, is a, dare I say, lightly put, an attitudinal thing that is, fueled by the blind eye, or the going along with, the structural or organizational piece that is in place, and it piles on and adds on. Jim Crow laws, if we talk about the succession from the Virginia slave laws to the further explication in that government, and Virginia, biggest of the colonies, became a model for the other colonies. And let it not be forgotten that there were slave laws established in Massachusetts and Rhode Island in 1640 and following. And so from that, you had other practices like, and she talks about this in Toward a Warmer Sun, white folks walking down the street on the sidewalk, and if a black person came by, they needed to give way to them and step off the curb and walk alongside. Numerous behavioral things, the likes of which. So the complicity, but also the systemic stuff. And the systemic stuff can't be noted, I'll just say this quickly, without looking at matters of economics, identity with regard to wealth, as well as land and enfranchisement. So,
Reverend Bill, you're speaking. The Q&A is blowing up, and I think people are really asking to bring it closer to home. In terms of everything you just said, how do you suggest that we respond as a community that in many ways is essentially segregated by caste? And also, how do you see the relationship between the Jews and Black people in the present time in America?
Yeah, those are the right questions to ask, by the way.
Yeah.
And let's be really, the Yiddish saying is tuchis auf den Tisch, which I can't really translate as put your tuchis on the table. But what it means is, pragmatically, how do we respond? We don't respond by looking at the whole world situation, but we respond by building relationship, person by person, heart to heart, honestly listening about who that other person is and what their life experience is. So at Larchmont Temple, for example, just to use, listen, we got a lot of work to do, but we knew When we watched the death of George Floyd and had that rally communally in Harbor Island Park, we knew we had to begin for real. We've had a 27, 28, 29-year relationship with the Black Pentecostal Straight Gate Church community in Mamaroneck, Amelia, around Westchester and Southern Connecticut, but we knew we had to talk and listen. So we developed a cultural conversation group that began with a dozen people and has 100 now, that meets monthly, that talks about a key cultural experience or video or book or article or poem, and we listen to each other. I remember Beth Belial, who's one of the key leaders at Larchmont Temple, and Tiffany Thrower, and they were talking, and the Jewish white folks in that group never heard about the conversation you have with your African-American child before they get behind the wheel to drive. They called it the talk. It was eye-opening for our folks. Why? Because we are in the dominant caste, right? Because white privilege is something that we don't think about, and yet we perpetuate. And so we have to talk. That's the number. I'm giving my number one answer. It's about building relationship. It's about understanding we are all created in the same image. There's only one race, if there's a race at all. It's the human race. Bill.
Yeah, I appreciate that greatly. And Stacey, you're really in a wonderful point here to, if we can't answer all these questions, have them noted for the sake of this step tonight and going forward. I said what I said earlier. I mean, here's complicity and the stuff of engagement that Rabbi Jess talks about, which I think is really profound. I think, quite frankly, too, this matter of caste, we need, matters of economic justice, racial justice, parity, in a system where we have witnessed the absence of that and the gross inequality due to caste and racial identity. The numbers of African-American men incarcerated exceed those who are attending secondary education, college education. In terms of disparity in wealth and the wealth gap, are really distinct among us. And I think what this book really points out, and other commentators address this as well, is looking back in history, as I mentioned a bit ago, when it came to economics, wealth, and land. There were people not just deprived but ripped off and violated. Nothing was left for them, even after promises, after the end of the Civil War. So going forward, I think incidents and examples like what we see in the city of Evanston, Illinois, in Asheville, North Carolina, and most recently in New York City, where I'm living and helping with a seminary right now, with my heart, with my brother and friends, with you all in Westchester in so many ways. In New York City, we have just witnessed the forming and the calling of a racial justice commission that is going to be looking distinctly and clearly at across the board matters of housing, matters of reparation, matters of even the totem, not so totem things of statuary and memorials, the like. So I just want to note that along the way, and it's really precious, as Rabbi Jeff notes what he has said about our dialogue and engagement too, because we're almost always ready, or it's more easy to have a commission or a committee than it is to really engage,
right.
one another with our neighbor.
I don't know if there's another question. I'll respond if there is, but I bet there is.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Please,
trying to kind of, I'm kind of trying to bring them all together.
Please.
What would you say to the person potentially in our community of the dominant class or caste, excuse me, who maybe isn't involved in a faith community, doesn't really have a connecting point, is beginning to see this? I know, Rabbi Sirkman, you mentioned relationships. And again, in a segregated community, it's a little bit hard sometimes to build relationships.
Yeah.
You know, how do we and why should we not just put our heads in the sand?
Yeah, it's so much easier, isn't it? Right. And yet. So a year ago, not even a year ago, before we started these cultural conversations, I had the idea that the tri-municipalities should have a program. It should be called Common Ground. We should work with CURE. And what it should be is, it should be for folks who are not the usual suspects. It's for those folks who aren't in the faith community, who don't enter into dialogue, who aren't involved in CURE. We should have it organized by other folks, but we should be involved. And we should begin by listening to each other. And maybe there's a touchstone. Maybe there's a rapper. We all listen to this rapper's song. And then we say, what did you think of this? And what did you think of this white person over there? And why is it such a different reaction here? And what does it mean to you to actually engage? And I called it Common Ground. And I thought there could be a monthly, presentation by somebody who's sort of a mini cultural icon or an author or a poet. And then we could have these small group discussions all around our dry municipalities. And eventually we'd get together when we can get together again, Stacy, and we would maybe do something. Maybe it'd be a social justice project. Maybe it would be a mural that we all paint. Maybe it's a field we all clean. I don't know what it is, but I think we have to go beyond our own houses of worship, our own little organizations, and go into the house to house and make this a connected community, a beloved community, Reverend Bill.
Yeah, a beloved community. I mean, we offer that term up a lot. That was really a credo from Martin Luther King himself, who called us to a beloved community and drew from scripture, drew from faith, as well as, the engaging the fullness of, dare I say, in the best sense of politics, the polis or the community, the gathering, as it were. I want to, hearken to Martin Luther King for a moment, because in this week of remembrance, and Yom HaShoah is upon us with this
wait, you can't steal my thunder, Reverend Bill. You can't steal my thunder. I got to tell. That's my big thing.
But this, don't you think, is a testimony to our wonderful relationship, that you're quoting Lutheran pastors and I'm lifting up the Jewish Remembrance Day.
I know you're Jewish for real.
There we go.
Fool me, Reverend Bill.
But all that is to say that what a week this is. It began at the end of Passover on Sunday, and that was Easter Sunday, April 4th, the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. It moved its way into this week of remembrance, which I can't forget is the 72nd birthday of Addie Mae Collins. Addie Mae Collins was one of the 4 little girls killed at the 16th Street bombing on September 15th, 19. And tomorrow is the anniversary, ominous date, of the assassination, the killing of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So, Rabbi, this is a doorstep into your comment, and even liturgical.
Yeah. Well, go ahead. Stacy, go ahead. I'm sorry.
There's a few questions in the chat, and maybe you can address this quickly as we're running short on time. The 1-drop rule, and we have the same in the 3/8 of, in the slave codes. There's several questions in the chat about how did the Nazis and maybe even potentially, the dominant caste determine these distinctions amongst people.
In Nuremberg, there were big discussions, and there were certain folks, ironically, the same guy who studied at the University of Arkansas, who wanted to have a more extreme, anybody who is basically 1/16 Jewish is Jewish. You go back, and then they eventually came down to, well, if you have 2 Jewish grandparents, or if there's so they tried to connect it. The problem with it all is, of course, what are we talking about? We're talking about the measure of humankind.
Yeah.
Right? The problem that we have is we live in siloed little bubbles or worlds, and we judge people by what we see, not by who they are. And so that it's the same. Can you be 3/5 a person if you're an African American in 1790? I mean, how absurd! How absurd!
I think too, and one of the things we haven't mentioned, and it's a part of Isabel Wilkerson's book, is that she, looked at Nazi Germany. She looked at Jim Crow in the American South. She also looked at India. And Stacy, to your question, in terms of the calibration, the system that in which all 3 of those systems draw from, is the Rabbi Jeff just pointed to, the element of purity, of what distinguishes those who are above head and shoulders, and the distinction of, as one of those books that she cites by Madison Grant that his publication Hitler called his Bible, it really does note that very distinct, specification as to, what the best, purity person is, if I could put it that way. And the effort, and this is a commendation to read the book further, she really takes pains to note that. Martin Luther King was drawn to that attention when he, in 1959, made his first trip to India. Mind you, he was a student of nonviolence and wanted to, learn from Mahatma Gandhi. But when he arrived, he was introduced to a group of school kids in a class of the lowest rung of 5 in the caste system in India, the Dalit population. And the headmaster introduced Dr. King to this group of students and said, he is an untouchable like you. And MLK was shocked to hear that, but quickly realized what that meant.
And you know what King came back and wrote, and he delivered at the commencement in 1961 at Lincoln University? King wrote, all of this is simply to say, all life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the way the world is made.
Yeah.
If I may, we're getting a little sermonic here, so you got a reverend, you got a
rabbi.
Blessings on you. But King called on us to be love struck about our neighbor. Here's a beloved community, here's a seamless garment, but here is a sense of love for and about our neighbor. And then we could talk about the religious antecedents for that and the like, but it's like, okay, we could bring on a rapper right now or some other music or some expression with liturgy.
It's going to happen too. Remain calm.
There we go.
I want to, before we get close, and I'm going to give you a final chance for closing thoughts, but I really do want to highlight this one question in the chat that comes from a woman who identifies herself as a minority and just makes the point that, it's not her responsibility or job to educate. And I think that those of us that maybe are coming to this and later in life, or it's not our Black, our brown, our sisters and brothers that are suffering because of a caste system, that it's their responsibility to help us along, and I just wanted to honor.
I want to underscore that. And if I implied that is the nature, that is not my implication. What I think our responsibility is to actually listen. Because, and I think, and for those open to dialogue, to talk to each other, to get to know each other's stories, to see the amazing weaving that is our village, our community, that people are going this way and that way, and that strengthens the fabric of this community.
I'm glad the question came up, and great thanks to that friend who brought it. It's not lost on us. I mean, here we are, a couple of white guys talking. I really think that, you know, it was said by some minority of folks in the 60s that what we have really is a white problem, not a Black problem. And so, you know, rather than, you know, have white folks race and run to talk with people of color to, you know, about how we can learn and be or whatever, there is some important work for white folks or privileged or dominant class folk to do. Isabel Wilkerson kind of notes that in some distinct ways. I mean, she really, this call, you know, is, as Rabbi Jeff has noted it, to engage into dialogue, but also, you know, back at the beginning, this matter of August Landsmesser, mind you, one of the reasons that he was stilled by that action there at that workers' rally was he happened to be in love with a Jewish woman. It was something of a crossed caste and biracial, or the equivalent thereof. And he couldn't sit still with that. You know, we have too many people among us, not too many, because there's never enough, in love, you know, and in whether they happen to be, as my father-in-law would say, you know, by the benefit of clergy, or, you know, connecting with neighbors, you know, we are across racial and cultural and other lines. And that call to love one another is really distinct, and to step away from the complicity. And I just really appreciate Wilkerson at the end where she says, we have a moral duty to develop empathy.
It's no accident that tonight is Yom HaShoah, that this is Holocaust Remembrance Day, that this is the day designated. It's also the day of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. And so Jews around the world tonight, all the way through tomorrow, are going to be remembering the 6 million, 1 million of them children, the total annihilation and destruction. And what does Wiesel, our teacher, teach us? That we are here to bear witness. So it isn't Black and brown population's responsibility. It's our responsibility to open our eyes, to open our hands, to open our hearts, to feel and reach and see. We are all witnesses.
Thank you both so much. I mean, you covered so much tonight with such passion and just insight, and we're approaching the end, and I know everyone would love to hear more and more, but if you could just summarize, and you maybe just did that, but in just one sentence, and maybe you can just repeat what you just said, you know, one sentence of what you want people to come away with from this conversation, the first of our series of just, and I could guess at it, but I'll give you a shot.
Reverend Bill?
Well, there's a call to the beloved community that recognizes that each and every one is precious and created equal. And, you know, they're in the face of objection and structures and bias and the systematic effort to separate, divide, distinguish, and to deny and violate. We are called to recognize one another as beloved. And you know, caste stands in the way of that. Let us do what we can to dismantle just that.
Thank you.
The Sufi story. The Sufi story is that a man is disgusted, so he goes down on his knees in prayer and he calls out to God and he says, God, I see the beaten, I see the beggar, I see the bruised and the broken. How could you stand there, God, and do nothing? How could you do nothing? And all of a sudden he hears a voice calling out from above or maybe inside him, of course I did something. I made you.
Thank you both so much. I just want everyone to know that we're going to do our best to respond to the questions that we didn't get to in an email following up the session, because we definitely don't want to leave anyone's important questions hanging. This again has been the first of 5 conversations, and we hope that everyone will join us on April 25th for Isabel Wilkerson herself. The hour has come to a close, but we are just so deeply grateful for you, Rabbi Sirkman, and you, Reverend Crawford, and the 5 libraries and all the organizations that have helped make this possible. It feels abrupt because there's so much depth of what we've been discussing. I might even suggest that you take a couple minutes just to sit with it when you leave here. If you could stay on the webinar for just a couple minutes, there's a way to digest is really a beautiful musical tribute from The Warmth of Other Suns by Martin Luther McCoy, performed by the City Church of San Francisco. And also, if you could fill out the survey, it would really help us to bring more events and conversations that the community would want. With deep gratitude, good night.
We are aware of your fear and exhausted from having to hide who we are. Pretending that we're less won't make you stronger in the end. You suffer from black pain for white gain. Crack laws versus cocaine. You don't consider all the horror that we've been through till we force a new horizon to come in view. Funny how you fashion yourself the hero. Deconstruction of the Negro. Oh, maybe we'll find our light in the warmth of other suns. The warmth of other suns, the warmth of other suns. Maybe we'll reach our height in the warmth of other suns, in the warmth of other suns, in the warmth of other. But digital mind control that tolls the soul by trolling each and every part of me. I just want to be free. You suffer from black pain for white gain. Crack laws versus cocaine. You don't consider it too cruel or unjust when it's done to us. Funny how you fashion yourself the hero. Deconstruction of the Negro. Maybe we'll find our light in the warmth of other suns, in the warmth of other suns, in the warmth of other suns. Maybe we'll reach our height in the warmth of other suns, in the warmth of other suns, in the warmth of other suns. Maybe we'll find our